Welcome back, everybody. It's Monday, August 3rd, 2026, and Iran just changed everything. Saturday night, the President of the United States pulled back from what officials were calling the biggest strike package assembled against Iran since the Second World War, and within hours the entire narrative around this war flipped upside down. Not because Iran won anything on the battlefield, not because the regime suddenly grew a spine, but because somebody picked up a phone, made a call, and convinced Washington that a deal was close enough to bet on. And that is exactly the kind of moment that changes the entire shape of a conflict. So let's get into it, because there is a lot to unpack here, and by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why Tehran is sweating bullets right now, even though, on paper, it looks like they just got a reprieve. Here's where we start. For days, two of the most connected national security outlets in the country had the same story coming out of the same rooms. The plan was set. Target folders were built around Iran's energy infrastructure, refineries, power generation, the kind of infrastructure that keeps a regime's lights on and its war machine fueled. Planners were reportedly aiming to have the operation wrapped before markets opened Monday morning, which tells you everything about the scale they were thinking. This wasn't a symbolic slap on the wrist. This was designed to be catastrophic to Iran's ability to function as a state actor in the region. And then, Saturday night, the president announced on social media that he was calling it off, but only conditionally. He said the pause was subject to being able to rapidly make a deal, and he laid out exactly what that deal needed to include. Immediate, complete, and total opening of the Strait of Hormuz, and an end to Iran's nuclear threat. Read that again. Those aren't soft asks. Those are the two things Iran has used as leverage against the entire world for the better part of a year, and the president just said, give me both, right now, or the planes go back up. So why did he actually pull back? This is where it gets interesting, because it wasn't Tehran that got this pause. It was Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. Saudi Arabia's de facto leader got the president on the phone and pushed hard against dragging the region into what he called a wider conflict. Qatar and the UAE reportedly made similar appeals. Now think about that for a second. These are the same Gulf states that have quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, supported pressure campaigns against Iran for years. These are the countries that have had their own refineries hit by Iranian-backed drones. These are the countries watching Iranian proxies undermine their own stability in Iraq and Yemen. And yet, when the moment came where the United States was ready to flatten Iran's energy grid, it was the Gulf neighbors asking for the brakes. Why? Because they know something the rest of us are only now catching up to. A regime that is cornered with nothing left to lose becomes the most dangerous version of itself. If you take away Iran's oil income entirely and overnight, in one weekend, you don't get de-escalation, you get a wounded animal thrashing in every direction it can reach, and the Gulf states are the ones sitting closest to the claws. Iran's own response to all of this tells you they know exactly how close the edge was. Their defense minister went on social media almost immediately and said the country was neither surprised nor passive, and that it remained on alert. That's not the language of a government that feels safe. That's the language of a government trying to project calm while internally bracing for the worst. And here's the tell that matters more than anything else in that statement. Iranian state media gave no indication whatsoever that Tehran had asked for the strikes to be called off, and gave no signal that its position on the Strait of Hormuz has changed even slightly. So think about what that means. The one thing the United States is demanding, full and total opening of the strait, Iran hasn't budged on publicly, even after getting handed a pause it did not earn. That's either supreme confidence, or it's a government that cannot afford to look weak in front of its own population, even when weakness might be exactly what's keeping the bombs from falling. And honestly, given everything else going on inside that country right now, I'd bet heavily on the second one. Because here's what most casual observers are missing, while they focus purely on the military side of this story. Iran is not just fighting an external war, it is simultaneously fighting an internal collapse that might be more dangerous to the regime than anything flying overhead. The rial, Iran's currency, has been in freefall for the better part of a year, sliding from roughly 600,000 to well over 1.4 million to the dollar at points, and even touching close to 2 million on parts of the open market. Let that sink in for a second. That is not a currency correction. That is a currency in cardiac arrest. Inflation has been sitting north of 50%. Basic goods, food, medicine, fuel, all of it, climbing out of reach for ordinary Iranians, while the people running the country still find ways to fly private, still find ways to move money through shadow networks, still find ways to protect their own. The government tried to placate the public with a small monthly cash allowance, something in the range of a few dollars per person per month, and one regional economist called it about as effective as throwing a bucket of water on a house fire. It wasn't fixing anything, it was theater. And when a government does theater instead of solutions, people notice. That's exactly what triggered protests that started with shopkeepers shutting down stalls in Tehran's Grand Bazaar and grew into demonstrations that spread across multiple cities. The kind of unrest analysts are calling the biggest direct challenge to the clerical leadership since the crackdown a few years back. The regime responded the way regimes like this always respond. Internet blackouts, mass arrests. The judiciary publicly promising, and I'm going to paraphrase this because it deserves paraphrasing, that there will be zero leniency for anyone labeled a rioter, with officials pushing prosecutors to move fast and hit hard. That's not governance. That's a government that knows its legitimacy is hanging by a thread and is choosing fear over reform because reform would require admitting the system itself is the problem. So now overlay the military pressure on top of that economic and political collapse, and you start to understand why this moment, right now, is different from every other tense weekend we've had in this conflict. The naval blockade that the United States has maintained in the Strait of Hormuz and along Iran's Persian Gulf coast has been running since the spring. And by the administration's own numbers, it's been costing Iran somewhere around $500 million a day. Multiply that out over the months this has been running, and you get a number that dwarfs almost anything Iran could hope to make up through sanctions, workarounds, or its shadow fleet of tankers running dark to avoid detection. And on top of the blockade, sanctions have been specifically targeting the financial networks that let regime-connected elites keep their skimming operation alive, even as ordinary Iranians starve for foreign currency. This is what real economic strangulation looks like. It's not flashy. It doesn't make for dramatic footage the way an airstrike does. But it's arguably doing more long-term damage to the regime's ability to function than any single bombing run could. Now let's talk about what's actually been happening on the ground, because while everyone's been fixated on whether the big strike package launches, there's been a steady drumbeat of smaller operations that tell their own story. Strikes hit positions belonging to an Iraqi armed coalition with deep ties to Iran-backed militias, killing at least 20 fighters, including several Iranians tied directly to the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, the branch that runs Iran's operations outside its own borders. A funeral was held in Najaf for members of that coalition alongside Guard personnel, which tells you Iran is now losing not just proxies, but its own people on foreign soil, in operations it can't openly claim, without admitting how deeply embedded its forces are in other countries' conflicts. That's a problem for a regime trying to maintain the fiction that it's a defensive power reluctantly dragged into fights it didn't start. And it's not just Iraq. Saudi Arabia's Aramco, the largest energy company on the planet, had one of its refineries and pumping stations hit by drones, sparking a massive fire at a facility responsible for a meaningful slice of global crude oil processing. Saudi officials pointed the finger at Iran-backed groups operating out of Iraq, and they made it clear publicly that they reserve the right to respond. Think about what that phrase actually means in this context. Saudi Arabia, a country that has spent years trying to avoid direct confrontation with Iran while quietly building one of the most capable air forces in the region. Over 900 aircraft, more than 200 F-15s, Eurofighter Typhoons, an indigenous aerial refueling fleet that lets them sustain operations for extended periods, is now publicly reserving the right to hit back. That's not a country bluffing. That's a country that has run out of patience. Kuwait has been dealing with drone attacks of its own. Iran has been threatening every single neighbor that allows American aircraft to use its airspace or its runways, essentially telling the entire Gulf, if you host the people trying to stop us, you become a target too. And that threat isn't hollow posturing anymore. It's already been acted on in smaller strikes and attempted attacks over the past several days. Which brings up an obvious and uncomfortable question. If Iran is threatening every neighbor that helps the United States and simultaneously claiming it wants a deal to end the war, which one is the real position? Because those two things cannot both be true for very long. Either Tehran is negotiating in good faith, or it's using the pause in bombing to reposition, resupply, and remind the region who it thinks still has teeth. My money, and honestly most serious regional analysts' money, is on the second one, at least for now. Let's talk about what the United States has actually said it's demanding, because this matters more than almost anything else in understanding why this particular weekend became the turning point. The stated condition for holding off strikes is not just some symbolic ceasefire. It's a full opening of the Strait of Hormuz, permanently, and a complete end to what's been described as Iran's nuclear threat. Those two conditions together essentially ask Iran to give up the only two cards it's held this entire war. The Strait is Iran's leverage over global oil markets, a choke point they've repeatedly claimed to control, even though, as the fact-checkers have pointed out over and over again, thousands of commercial vessels have continued sailing through it throughout the conflict, because Iran simply does not have the capability to actually close an international waterway, no matter how many times their state media claims otherwise. And the nuclear program is their leverage over the entire international community, the thing that's kept every major power at the table even while sanctioning them into the ground. Ask a regime to give up both of those things, and you're not asking for a ceasefire. You're asking for surrender dressed up in diplomatic language, and everyone in that region knows it. That's why the Secretary of State's comments landed the way they did when he told reporters that Iran is now confronting a different kind of president, someone who actually takes action instead of just issuing warnings. Because if you look at the pattern of this entire administration's approach to Iran, that's exactly what's played out. Threats followed by strikes, sanctions followed by more sanctions. A blockade that's actually enforced rather than just denounced. And now, even in the moment where the president pulled back from the biggest strike package of the war, he did it publicly, conditionally, with an explicit deadline hanging over it, essentially telling Tehran, here's your one shot. Take it, or the next conversation happens over the sound of jets. Now, here's something worth sitting with for a second, because it says a lot about how this administration is thinking about leverage. The president posted a chart showing the collapse of the rial from roughly 900,000 to nearly 1.9 million against the dollar, framing it explicitly as proof that the pressure campaign is working. Think about that from a messaging standpoint. Most administrations don't publicly celebrate the suffering of a foreign population, even an adversary's population, because it can look callous. But this is a calculated move designed to send two messages simultaneously. To Iran's leadership, it says, we see exactly what's happening to your economy, and we know it's because of us. And to Iran's population, whether intentionally or not, it draws a direct line between the regime's choices and their daily suffering. Whether you think that's smart strategy or not, it's undeniably effective psychological pressure on a government that is already dealing with the most serious domestic unrest it's faced in years. So let's talk military capability for a second, because if talks collapse Monday, and there is a very real chance they do given Iran's public posture, the question becomes, what does round two actually look like? And this is where things get genuinely serious, because the target set being discussed isn't military bases anymore, it's energy infrastructure, refineries, power generation. The kind of targets that don't just degrade a military's ability to fight, they degrade a country's ability to function as a modern state. No refined fuel means no functioning transportation network. No power generation means hospitals running on generators, means factories shutting down, means an already collapsing economy losing whatever's left holding it together. This is the kind of campaign that doesn't just punish a regime, it accelerates the exact kind of internal collapse that's already been building since the protests started. And that's precisely why the Gulf states pushed so hard against it happening this weekend. They know what happens when a government like this one gets pushed into a corner with literally nothing left to lose. It doesn't surrender gracefully, it lashes out at everyone within reach. And everyone within reach happens to be their neighbors. Let's also talk about what Iran actually has left to fight with, because this matters enormously for understanding the risk calculus here. Iran's conventional navy has been reduced to what people in the region have started calling mosquito fleets, small fast attack craft that swarm rather than confront directly, because anything larger simply doesn't survive in contested waters against a modern naval force. Their ballistic missile program has taken serious hits over the course of this war, but it's not gone. And every intelligence estimate suggests they've still got meaningful stockpiles distributed across a network of hardened bunkers that have taken years and enormous oil revenue to build. Shahd drones remain their most cost-effective weapon, cheap to produce, hard to fully intercept in large numbers, and exactly the kind of asymmetric tool a cornered regime reaches for when it can't win conventionally. And there have been persistent reports of attempts to smuggle in shoulder-fired anti-air missiles through overland routes, specifically to try to threaten the kind of low, slow aircraft that have been effective at hunting drones and small boats throughout this campaign. None of this adds up to a force capable of winning a conventional war against the coalition arrayed against it, but it's more than enough to make round two extremely costly, extremely messy, and extremely dangerous for anyone caught in the crossfire, which is exactly why every neighbor with American assets on their soil just got a fresh warning to consider their exposure. If you're new here and you're trying to make sense of how fast the situation keeps shifting week to week, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because this story is nowhere close to finished, and the next 72 hours could genuinely reshape the entire regional map. Drop a comment too. I want to know what you think actually happens Monday, because I've got my own read on it, and I'll get to that in a second. But I'm curious if the audience sees it the same way. Here's the strategic picture as I read it. This was never really about whether the United States could execute that strike package. Nobody seriously doubts the capability exists. The question was always whether executing it serves the broader goal, and the broader goal here isn't just punishing Iran, it's engineering an outcome where the regime either fundamentally changes its behavior or loses the ability to threaten the region at all. A campaign against energy infrastructure accomplishes the second goal ruthlessly, but it risks making the first one impossible, because you can't negotiate meaningful behavioral change with a government that's been reduced to rubble and has nothing left to lose. That's the calculation the Gulf states were making when they picked up the phone, and it's almost certainly the same calculation happening inside the White House. Keep the threat real enough that Tehran believes the planes are coming, but hold off just long enough to see if the threat alone forces the concession that the bombs would have forced anyway, at a fraction of the cost and risk. But here's the problem with that strategy, and it's the same problem every negotiation with this particular regime has run into for years. Iran's leadership doesn't actually control the situation the way a rational actor would need to in order to make a quick, clean deal. You've got competing power centers, the elected government trying to project a willingness to negotiate, the Revolutionary Guard, which has its own independent command structure, its own economic empire, and its own institutional interest in keeping the conflict alive because a wartime footing justifies its continued grip on power. You've got a judiciary signaling internally that it's ready to crack down harder on domestic dissent rather than address the grievances driving it. And you've got an aging supreme leader with a succession question hanging over the entire system, with reports suggesting his son is positioned to take over, which means every major decision right now isn't just about managing an external war. It's about managing an internal power transition at the exact moment the country is under the most external pressure it's faced in decades. That is an almost impossible environment to negotiate a fast, clean deal in, no matter how badly individual officials might want one. So when Iran's defense minister says the country is neither surprised nor passive, what he's really signaling is that different factions inside that government are pulling in different directions, and the public statement has to thread a needle between projecting strength for domestic consumption and not accidentally torpedoing whatever diplomatic track is still open. That's an incredibly difficult balance to strike, and history tells us regimes under this kind of internal strain rarely thread it well. They either crack down harder domestically, which accelerates the protest movement rather than suppressing it, or they lash out externally to rally nationalist sentiment, which is exactly the kind of miscalculation that turns a paused strike campaign back on in an instant. Now let's zoom out even further, because this conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum, and what's happening with Iran is connected to a much bigger story about how the global balance of power is shifting in real time. China has continued flying cargo aircraft into Iran throughout the sanctions regime, officially described as humanitarian or civilian cargo, but regional intelligence assessments have flagged concerns about what's actually on those flights, given the pattern of behavior. Russia, meanwhile, has been leaning on North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles in its own war in Ukraine, a sign that Moscow's own stockpiles are strained enough that it's importing weapons, rather than relying purely on domestic production. Put those two data points together and you start to see the outline of an entire authoritarian bloc: Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China in a support role, all facing simultaneous pressure from a United States that is currently running a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf, backing Ukraine's air defense buildup, and expanding military cooperation with allies in the Pacific all at the same time. That is an extraordinary amount of simultaneous pressure being applied across multiple theaters, and it's not an accident. It's a deliberate strategy of stretching adversaries thin on every front at once, so that none of them can fully commit resources to helping the others. And here's the thing about that strategy that should genuinely worry Tehran more than any single strike package. Even a Russian strategic assessment, one that reportedly circulated among their own analysts, has apparently concluded that Moscow can no longer compete with the United States economically, technologically, or militarily on equal terms. If that assessment is accurate, and there's reasonable evidence to suggest it reflects real internal thinking rather than just propaganda, then Iran's most powerful potential backer is quietly acknowledging it's outmatched in the exact great power competition that's supposed to be providing Iran cover. That leaves Iran leaning almost entirely on China for meaningful support, and China has shown zero appetite throughout this entire war for direct confrontation with the United States on Iran's behalf. They'll sell equipment, they'll fly in supplies. They will not send their own military into a shooting war over Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Which means strip away all the rhetoric, and Iran is standing largely alone against a coalition that now includes not just the United States and Israel, but increasingly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar as active or tacit participants in containing them. That is the real reason this weekend changed everything, and it's the real reason Trump is, in the sense that matters, holding all the leverage even in the moment where he appeared to blink first. Pulling back the strike wasn't weakness. It was recognition that the pressure campaign already running, the blockade, the sanctions, the currency collapse, the domestic unrest, the regional isolation, is doing more sustained damage to the regime's ability to function than a single massive bombing run could accomplish in one weekend, and doing it without the diplomatic fallout of flattening a country's power grid. The strike package isn't gone. It's parked, fueled, and ready, sitting there as the explicit consequence hanging over Monday's negotiating table. That's not panic from Washington. If anything, it's the opposite. It's patience backed by overwhelming force. which might be an even more unsettling position for Tehran to be negotiating against than an actual airstrike would be. Because you can survive a bombing run and rebuild. It's much harder to survive a slow economic strangulation that your own population is already blaming you for. So where does this actually go from here? If Monday's talks produce something real, an actual verifiable opening of the strait and meaningful movement on the nuclear question, this could genuinely be the beginning of the endgame for the active military phase of this conflict, even if the underlying tensions with the regime persist for years afterward. But if Iran shows up to that table the same way its state media has been talking all weekend, defiant, unmoved, insisting nothing has actually changed on their end, then the pause was never a de-escalation. It was just a delay, and everything currently parked and ready gets airborne again, probably faster and with less warning than last time, because the diplomatic patience that bought this pause will have been tested and found wanting. Given everything happening inside Iran right now, the currency in free fall, the protests the regime is struggling to contain, the internal power struggle over succession, the increasingly hostile posture from every single neighbor, I don't think this regime has the institutional coherence right now to make the kind of fast, clean, verifiable deal Washington is demanding. Not because individual officials don't want to avoid more strikes, but because the system itself is too fractured, too busy fighting its own population and its own internal power struggles. To speak with one voice at the exact moment one voice is what's required. That's my read on it, but I genuinely want to hear yours. Because this is exactly the kind of moment where reasonable people looking at the same information can land in very different places. Do you think Monday's talks actually produced something real? Or do you think we're looking at a temporary pause before an even bigger campaign than the one that got called off this weekend? Drop that in the comments, because I read every single one, and some of the best analysis in this entire space comes from the discussion underneath these videos, not just what's said in front of the camera. And if you found this breakdown useful, share it with somebody who's been trying to make sense of what's actually happening over there, because there is an enormous amount of noise and speculation flying around right now, and cutting through that noise to the actual strategic picture is exactly what this channel exists to do. One more thing worth sitting with before we wrap this up. Every single time this conflict has reached a moment that looked like it might resolve cleanly, it hasn't. Because the fundamental problem was never really about any single grievance that could be negotiated away in one sitting. It's about a regime whose entire model of survival depends on external conflict and internal repression working together, and you cannot negotiate a permanent peace with a government whose stability requires an enemy to point at. Every time the external pressure eases even slightly, the internal pressure from a population that has had enough becomes the bigger threat to the regime's survival. And every time the internal pressure builds, lashing out externally becomes the tool the regime reaches for to distract from it. That cycle has repeated itself for months now, and there's no obvious reason to think this particular weekend breaks it permanently, even if it buys a few more days of relative calm. What we do know is that the assets are positioned, the target folders are built, the coalition of regional partners quietly supporting the pressure campaign is more aligned than it's been at any point in this conflict, and the domestic situation inside Iran is deteriorating in ways that no amount of state media messaging can fully paper over anymore. Whatever happens Monday, and whatever happens in the days after that, this is a regime running out of runway on almost every front simultaneously, economically, militarily, and politically. Trump didn't blink this weekend. He recalculated, and recalculation backed by that much simultaneous pressure is a far more dangerous position for Tehran to be sitting across from than a single strike ever could have been. Let's also talk about the humanitarian dimension of this, because it rarely gets the attention it deserves in a conflict that's mostly covered through the lens of hardware and headlines. Medical evacuation operations have continued running throughout this campaign, moving wounded personnel and civilians out of the theater on a regular rotation, and that alone tells you the human cost of this conflict has been steady and significant for months, even during weekends where the headlines are dominated purely by diplomatic maneuvering. Every strike package, every blockade extension, every round of sanctions carries a human toll that doesn't always make it into the strategic analysis. And it's worth remembering that behind every geopolitical calculation, there are real people on every side of this, absorbing the consequences of decisions made in rooms they'll never see. That doesn't change the strategic reality of what needs to happen to end this conflict, but it's worth holding both truths at once. That pressure campaigns work precisely because they're painful, and that the pain is real and ongoing for millions of ordinary people who had no say in any of the decisions that got them here. It's also worth addressing directly why this particular pressure campaign has been more effective than previous attempts at containing this regime. Past administrations tried sanctions alone and watched Iran adapt around them through shadow fleets and black market oil sales. Past administrations tried diplomacy alone and watched the regime use negotiating tables as a stalling tactic to keep enriching uranium while talks dragged on for years. What's different this time is the combination, sanctions, plus an actively enforced naval blockade, plus a credible and demonstrated willingness to use military force, plus close coordination with regional partners who have their own reasons to want this resolved. Take away any single one of those four pillars, and this pressure campaign probably doesn't work nearly as well. It's the combination that's created a situation where Iran genuinely cannot find an off-ramp that doesn't involve real concessions. Because every alternative path they might have used in the past, waiting out sanctions, exploiting divisions between Western allies, using proxies to bleed opponents slowly without direct confrontation, has been systematically closed off one at a time over the course of this war. That's also why the timing of this pause matters so much strategically. Calling it off this specific weekend, right as the currency was hitting fresh lows and right as internal unrest was already straining the regime's security apparatus, maximizes the psychological pressure on Tehran without actually delivering the kind of external shock that might unify the population behind the government the way foreign attacks sometimes do. There's a well-documented pattern in international relations where populations rally around their own leadership in the immediate aftermath of a foreign strike, at least temporarily, out of nationalist reflex, even if they despise that leadership. By holding off at exactly this moment, the administration denies Iran's government that potential rally effect, and instead leaves the population's anger pointed squarely at their own leadership's mismanagement of the economy, which is precisely where that anger has been building for months already. Whether that was an intentional part of the calculation or simply a fortunate byproduct of good timing, the effect is the same, and it's a genuinely sophisticated way to apply pressure. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through. It was a long breakdown, but this is a moment that genuinely deserved the depth. If you want more of this kind of grounded, no-nonsense analysis on where this conflict is actually heading, rather than just chasing whatever clip is trending that day, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update. Because based on everything laid out here, the next update is probably not far away. Take care of yourselves out there, and we'll see you in the next one.